Thank you, Eric. Yeah, and it's really a privilege to actually give this talk after Padis here, because Padis and I have worked, I think, close to 10 years together now, and we have never been at the same conference. They would always invite Padis, and she would say she would be too busy, and then I would come instead. And now I actually got to invite her to come here and talk, so that's pretty awesome. So I wanted to take it from what Padis was talking about, is like how genomic can really revolutionize our sort of outbreak response. And then take it a little further and say, okay, we have an outbreak going on of Zika right now. What can that tell us about what's going on in Florida? So I just want to start with an animation here. So it starts in Mexico, just south of the border here. And just let this run. Okay, so I didn't just show you the sort of migration of bad hombres out of Mexico here, but could somebody tell me what that is? What did I just show you here? Flu, exactly. So this was H1N1, which started in Mexico in 2009, right? And what was interesting with this is that in about 6 weeks, flu spread across the world that normal flu will take about 6 months to do. That's pretty fast, and this is something we have no vaccines, we have no treatments, we have nothing at that point, right? What we're trying to do is to try and understand how does this happen and how could we actually do something about it. So the diseases, the viruses we study, like Padis mentioned, Lassa, Ebola, a lot of that stuff in the past, and now also sort of zooming into Zika. And what we're doing here is that, okay, so we're doing genomics, right? When we talk about genomics, usually you think about the human genome. That is not what we're doing. We're sequencing the virus that infects humans, not the humans themselves. And the way that we do that is that we have a patient coming in, we get a blood sample, then we essentially sequence everything that's in that blood sample, similar to what you heard with the medicinal genomic sequencing this morning. And then importantly, as people infect other people, what we can do is we say, okay, so now we get a transmission chain and say, okay, how did the virus look like in patient 1? How did the virus look like in patient 2? And maybe they're on 2 different continents, or maybe we can get a mosquito in there too. Figure out what do the viruses look like. And then what we do is saying, okay, but these mentioned open data release as well, make all of this available immediately. We have some fairly simple but very relevant questions. So we're doing outbreak response, outbreak research here, right? So there's no point in doing stuff that could be helpful 10 years down the line, which you're hoping to publish sort of 5 years down the line. These are simple questions that are relevant to the outbreak that's going on right now. And what you apply to that is some sort of number crunching. So I just wanted to mention this, that when you do that, because things move so fast, right? We can't wait 5 years to publish this. Things move so fast that it really has to be open science, right? The data has to be out there, the findings have to be out there, so everybody can get to work on it. And the reason for that is that, yeah, I can think of questions that we should address here, but there's all these smart people out there too that can think of questions I certainly cannot think of. So I think it's important that they have access to the data too. So the way that we do this is that there's no really good frameworks for that, but we made it available on NCBI and public databases. Put it on our lab website here. We actually put it under the tab that's called Secrets, just so maybe people won't notice it. But under Secrets here, we put our protocols online too, so other people can actually do what it is that we're doing in the lab. Like Padis mentioned, sequencing Zika is really hard. But we worked with a group, Nick Lohman, and we really cracked it together, figured out, okay, how can we do this? So immediately that protocol was made available online. Here's the Google Doc that Nate put online, and also on bioarchives and things like that, so other people can do the same. So with that comes, so these are, what's actually just come out of the Zika papers here now. So you see 3 major papers here. There's a fair number of authors on all of these. And amongst all of these authors, we had to coordinate. Right? How are we going to publish? How are we going to get the data out there? What questions are we going to address? And that's how we're doing that. We're saying, okay, amongst all of these authors, which is huge, right, manage to actually coordinate this science and say, okay, it's important we work together instead of trying to work against each other. And I think things like coordination and preprints is really the way to kind of do this kind of research. So zooming into, what's going on with Zika epidemic here. So we mentioned this, that, discovered in Africa and sort of seemed to have lived in Africa probably for quite some time. And then from Africa spread into Asia, and then from Asia, that's really when a new wave started that hit first Micronesia, French Polynesia, and then 2014 it was detected in Brazil. And once Zika hit Brazil, this is really when we started hearing about it, because now you have a lot of naive population, a lot of people get infected, And all of a sudden we realized that things like microcephaly and other neurological symptoms is something you can get if you get infected with Zika. So from Brazil, that's really where it spread out, and then across later up here to Florida too. So zooming in on Florida, and Padis mentioned this too, that, okay, so we have a lot of cases coming into Florida, and we pass it into the travel-associated cases. These are travelers that just come into Florida, come from some country, got infected with Zika, and it gets detected in Florida. Now, this happened across the country, right? This happened every state of the United States. But then what happened was that sort of late July, all of a sudden there was this notice that, okay, there's also some of these local cases. So all of a sudden there was cases, there were no travel history, yet they had Zika. So we knew that, okay, it must be in Florida now. And we sort of broke that in and say, okay, so if we look at most of these were in Miami-Dade County, and then mostly in these three areas, Miami Beach, Wynwood, and Little River. And there's a couple of cases also outside that, Broward and Palm Beach, and then also up in Pinellas here. So what we do is, okay, we get samples here, we get samples from patients, we get samples from mosquitoes, and then we sequence them. And we got a total from this 35 samples, sequences rather, from Miami, one up for Pinellas, and then we sort of start doing the number crunching here. So I mentioned that the questions are pretty simple, right? So again, simple questions with a lot of relevance. So these are the kinds of things we're interested in. First of all, we know for Zika, there can be a lot of non-mosquito-borne transmission of the virus. So the question we had first was like, okay, is it mosquito-borne? Right? That's a pretty simple question. It's really hard to address unless you actually do the sequencing. Things like, when did it arrive? We detected it in July, but does it really mean that it arrived, a couple of weeks earlier? Things like, did it move around into Miami? We all remember these little quadrants that, the CDC would put out and saying this is where Zika is. If you're inside, that's a problem. If you're outside, it's good. Question is, how many times did this happen? Did it just happen once, or did it happen actually multiple times? Where did it come from and how? And then also a thing of importance is the why Miami? Like almost all these cases occurred in Miami and, in southern Florida. And the question is there something special about the environment there? So we looked into all of these questions, and the first one, as I mentioned, is, okay, was it mosquito-borne? Yes, it is. And the way that we can really show that is that this graph shows the number of Zika cases here, and then over here we can see the mosquito abundance. So download all the data set from the mosquito abundance, and what you can see is that they follow each other perfectly, almost perfectly, right? So it really tells you that if the mosquito abundance goes down, the number of cases will also go down. It tells you two things. First of all, it's mosquito-borne. More importantly, if you get rid of the mosquito, you also get rid of the Zika cases. And the question is, okay, what actually caused a drop like this? So what we looked at here is saying, okay, we could see the insecticide usage was online. So we downloaded that data and overlaid it here. And what you can see is, okay, insecticide usage goes up, mosquito abundance goes down. This is what you would expect, but it's pretty nice to see, right? That you actually have something effective here in which you can use to get rid of the Zika cases. Okay, mosquito-borne. The question is, so when did this actually happen? So I mentioned July is when we detected the first cases. We do some phylogenetics here, the Patis also showed you. And that allows us to sort of figure out, okay, when did the virus likely arrive in Florida? And what we find from this is that it probably happened sometime in the spring of 2016. Right? So spring is earlier than summer. So we think that it was probably in Florida for like 2, 3, 4 months or so before we actually got this first case detected. So earlier than what you would actually have expected. So that tells you that. The question is, did it move? Okay, because, okay, it came into Florida, but then what happened when it came to Florida? Because, again, there was all these sort of quadrant here set up. Okay, there's Zika transmission in there, but nothing outside. It's unclear to me why they're not, for example, squares. But the question is there actually any transmission between these two areas of Zika transmission? And the way that we can look at that is saying, okay, what does the virus look like here, and what does the virus look like here? And do we actually have separation between these two? So if we look over here, the separation would mean that for these two clusters, here's one cluster here, another cluster here, you would only see the same color. If you only had the same color, it would tell you, yes, they're separated. They're two separate transmission chains. But what you can see is that that is not what we find. We actually find that they're all intermixed, right? So we have blue and we have green together, which means that there's the same virus is actually in different quadrants of Miami. So it shows you that the virus itself moved around. probably via infected people, right? It's probably not the mosquito that flies around. It's probably just infected people moving around areas of Miami. And I think the really sort of crunch point with that is that we actually had an infected mosquito. We had a trap which was installed on Miami Beach. And in that trap, we had, on day 1, say, we had 1 mosquito. And then 2 weeks later, we had another mosquito where we could actually sequence the virus from that very same trap. And we looked at it and said, okay, if the virus stays the same, that virus should essentially be identical. But it wasn't. They were completely different viruses from the same trap in Miami Beach. So it really tells you that the virus here is moving around. But the question is, so how many times did this happen? So this comes down to the question of, did it only get into Florida once, and then that's where you have that outbreak, or did this actually happen multiple times? And I didn't really know what to expect here, but I probably thought that, well, it just happened once, and then we have an outbreak, and it goes away. That is not what we see. So if we just look at our own data, so the sequences that we have generated, and we have to remember that this is a subset of the total number of cases that you have in Florida. If we only look at our own data, we can actually see at least 4 introductions. Okay, so this is the way the introductions were clustered together here. So you can see this is 1 introduction, it's another introduction, there's a 3rd introduction, there's a 4th introduction up here, right? So in our data set of 35 samples, we see 4 individual introductions. That's quite a lot. So we can say, okay, if we see that in our data set, what if we sort of apply that to all the number of patients that we actually saw in Florida, to do some modeling on that? We actually see that the total number of introductions that caused the outbreak that we saw in Miami is quite substantial, maybe in the order of 30 introductions or so. So, and as you say, introductions leading to local transmission, right? So we don't just have this 1 introduction of the virus coming in, establishing transmission, then you have cases. This is something that is organic process occurring over and over again. Most of these probably only led to 1 case that we never detected, right? So maybe it was detected in a patient record, but we certainly didn't get to actually sequence it. Okay, multiple times. Next question is, where did it come from? That's pretty important too, right? And what's interesting here is that by far the vast majority of these come from the Caribbean. So we knew that, okay, there was most of the cases were in South America, especially in Brazil. But the Caribbean had a lot of cases too. And what's unique here is there's really a lot of traffic between the Caribbean and Florida. So it's pretty clear when we look at these introductions, it's the Caribbean almost every time over and over again. Right? So, and as I mentioned, saying, okay, so is that unexpected? And well, okay, let's download all the travel data that we can get. Let's split it into airplanes and into cruise ships. And saying, okay, do we actually have a lot of traffic from the Caribbean? So this is what we say. And that is exactly what we see. So what we're looking at here is the estimated proportion of infected travelers. So this takes into consideration both the amount of traffic, but also how big the population is and how many people are actually infected, estimated to be infected with Zika in that region. And what you can see is that as we compare the Caribbean here, for example, to South America, so a lot more travelers coming in from the Caribbean. Another thing that's interesting here is you can say, okay, we also split it into flights and cruises. And what you can see here is the vast majority of these people actually come via cruise ships. That's not something I would have expected, but there's a big tourism industry in Florida. Of course, we have a lot of cruise ships going back and forth between Florida and the Caribbean. I should point out, though, that it doesn't mean that going on a cruise ship is going to get you Zika, right? It just serves as the vessel between Florida and the Caribbean. So Zika is not on the cruise ship, it's actually in the Caribbean, right? So that's the risk factor, not the cruise ship itself. Okay, so, and that's important, like full disclaimer here. Well, I talked about a booming, cruise ship industry in Florida. We'll see. But again, importantly, it's not the cruise ships, right? It's just that's why you have the most traffic coming from. Okay. So then the last question was I mentioned saying, okay, but why Miami? Because you have all of this is happening in Miami. There's a little bit going on in Texas too, but the vast majority of this was really Miami. So that was the next question we actually addressed. So the way that we looked at that and saying, okay, let's now look at just the overall traffic coming in, and now we're combining cruise ships and airplanes. And then just look in Florida in general, and the larger the blob here, the more travel, as you can see. And what you can see is that, okay, Miami receives, as you would expect, a vast amount of traffic coming in, both cruise ships and planes. But what is important here is that, well, but the mosquitoes also have to be there, right? So in order to establish transmission, the mosquito that carries Zika, Aedes aegypti, also has to be present. And this is where things get interesting, because if you look at January, for example, it's really only in the Miami area where you have a significant, or sort of, you have mosquitoes at all, whereas in the rest of Florida, you don't really have the mosquito present, right? And what is important here is that we think that the introduction of the virus, and again, it happened many times, right? This is what we see every time, is that the introduction of the virus happens somewhere between this and that. Okay, so probably you need this, year-long population of Aedes aegypti to actually be present. And maybe importantly is that you need that to actually be increasing its population size as the virus comes in. And those two together is really what sort of can establish the transmission chains, right? So that really puts you saying, okay, it makes sense that it's Miami just based on the traffic you're getting coming in, and because we also know that the mosquito is actually present there. Let's zoom out and say, okay, Florida, what does that actually look like for the rest of the country? Because there's been a lot of talk about Aedes aegypti being present in many different states in the United States. The question is, are these all at risk of Zika? The sort of quick answer to it is that yes, whenever you have the mosquito, there is a risk. But the fact is, though, that if we do this same sort of analysis, and now we're looking at the number of travelers, again, what you're seeing is overlaying whether there's mosquitoes here. What you can see is that Florida is really the only place where you have this early season mosquito abundance, right? It's the only place where you have the Aedes aegypti, and it is also the place where you have lots of traffic. I should say that here we're looking at cruise ship traffic, but if we add the flight traffic to that, the picture is exactly the same. Right, so Florida is really quite unique here because you have lots of traffic coming in and you also have the mosquito present. The rest of the country, even though later in the year that yes, there will be other places where you have Aedes aegypti, and yes, you also have a lot of traffic coming in, but that's probably not where the virus is actually establishing transmission. So it tells you in terms of risk, probably focus on Florida, maybe not so much in the rest of the country. So the last point I just wanted to make based on this is I'm saying, okay, but what fuels these epidemics or these outbreaks, right? Because Zika is now gone in Florida. There's nothing there, probably because the mosquito population went down so far. So if you were to start a new outbreak, it's really dependent on viruses coming in again, right? So the outbreak in Florida, for example, is very dependent on what goes on around the globe, right? What's happening in the Caribbean, what's happening in the Americas in general, right? Because only if we actually have a lot of Zika cases in, for example, the Caribbean, is when you will actually have the risk of starting a new outbreak in Florida. So with that, I just wanted to mention it's the same, but Patrice's point is there's a huge collaboration, really a lot of people involved.